Good morning. Welcome to Penn State Behrend's Rise and Shine webinar, Economic Effects of COVID-19. I am Britt Danke, Associate Director of Development and Alumni Relations at Penn State Behrend, and today's moderator. I'd like to welcome Dr. Kenneth Louie, Director of the Economic Research Institute of Eerie and Associate Professor of Economics at the Black School of Business at Penn State Behrend. Dr. Louie received his undergraduate degree from Northwestern University and his master's and doctorate degrees from the University of Illinois. He has received the Penn State Behrend Council of Fellows Award for Excellence in Teaching and was a Fulbright lecturer in the People's Republic of China in 1998. Welcome, Dr. Louie.
Well, thank you very much, Britt, and welcome everybody to our webinar this morning. We are so glad that you can join us. I'd like to especially welcome our Penn State alumni to this event. We're also very happy to have you. Just a brief note that there's going to be a lot of information that I will try to present to you as succinctly as possible. And also we can approach this very, very important and timely issue from many different angles, emphasizing different themes. But since our time is limited, my approach will be to offer a very broad analysis of the economic effects of COVID. You can certainly look at it from other angles as well, although we won't have time to explore other angles in this brief webinar. But you are certainly welcome to contact me if you would like more information. I will have my contact information at the end of the presentation. So with that, let me share my screen with you. And we can begin. So the first place to begin is to explain what the Economic Research Institute is. What do we do? The Economic Research Institute of Eerie was really established in 1982, almost 40 years ago. Next year, we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary, as a matter of fact. And our primary mission is to collect and analyze data on the Eerie regional economy. Our main goal is to help the local community better understand the regional economy and how it's linked to the national and indeed the global economy. We also serve to provide our students with relevant experience in applied economic research and data analysis. As you can see here, we do a lot of things, lots of activities, publish many things. Here's just a small sampling. All of these items are available for free download from our website. So if you're interested, you're welcome to go to our website, given at the bottom here. We have a comprehensive guide to the Eerie economy in the upper left-hand corner, you can see. But our signature publication perhaps is our Eerie Leading Index in the upper right-hand corner. This comes out as a newsletter on a regular basis. And as you can see, our most recent issues featured analysis of the impact of the COVID pandemic. We're very fortunate that we are very well respected in the community. We are essentially the go-to source for anything regarding the Eerie economy. And our commentary and analysis have been featured both in the local news media and also in the national news media. These are some of the examples of media outlets that have contacted us, that have asked us for analysis and commentary on the Eerie economy. But perhaps our proudest accomplishment is our training of leaders of the future. We're very, very proud to be able to hire every year some of the best Penn State Behrend students to be research assistants at our research institute. And here is a very small sample of some of our very best alumni, research assistants here who have gone on and been very, very successful in their own careers. And we look forward to continuing this in the future. Let's now talk about today's major theme, today's webinar. And because there's so much information, I'd like to give you an overview first. We're going to be talking about the impact of the pandemic, first on the US macroeconomy, and then on the Eerie economy. We all know that the Eerie economy typically follows the national economy, as is true for many other locales. What happens at the national level ultimately will have a major impact on us here locally. So that's why we want to look first at the national macro economy and then our local area. There is much we can look at, but economists typically focus on several very, very fundamental metrics or indicators of economic performance. So I will try to organize my remarks around these major metrics. And they're very simple. It's the level of employment, because we all know work is very important. It generates income, purchasing power, and ultimately economic well-being. Then I'll talk about output, what economists call real gross domestic product, or GDP. That's important because it's a measure of how robust the economy is in terms of generating goods and services. And finally, we look at income, which is the result of productive activity and which allows consumers to have that purchasing power to consume goods and services, which lead to improvements in the standard of living. So employment, output, and income are the three key metrics. I'll also briefly talk about our signature publication here at the Institute, which is the Eerie Leading Index. I'll briefly talk about what that is saying in the recent months regarding the impact of the pandemic on the local economy. And just finally, all of the data that I'm going to show you, if they are monthly, they have been seasonally adjusted to remove typical seasonal biases in the patterns of the data. Then I'll finish up with brief remarks about ongoing uncertainties and challenges that remain for us to try to resolve. But I'll try to end on a rather optimistic note. I'll provide some cautious optimism at the end. So with that, let me start by talking about the impact of the COVID pandemic on the US economy. As you can see in this first chart, over the last 100 years or so, there really have been three major economic events that have been transformative. You can look at other more minor events, but these three really stick out. All of us have lived through the most recent two. I don't think any of us have lived through the Great Depression. But as you can see, all of these events, the Depression in the late 20s, early 30s, the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009, and the pandemic from last year, which is still ongoing, all of these have caused significant trauma to the economy. This slide shows the level of employment. So that was the first metric that I described. How many people are gainfully employed? As you can see, in each of these episodes, there were significant drops in the level of non-farm employment. So that's one major takeaway we can see. Now, if you were to compare the three episodes, which one was more severe? Certainly, the Great Depression was very, very severe. We lost over 7.5 million jobs between 1929 and 1933. But in fact, the recent pandemic, if you look at the beginning from January to April of last year, we lost over 22 million jobs in the US economy. 22 million versus 7.5 million during the Great Depression. So in absolute terms, this pandemic, unfortunately, has been much, much more severe. During the Great Recession in 2007, 2009, we lost about 8 million jobs at the national level. Even though we've lost over 22 million jobs in the pandemic, we still consider the Great Depression to be even more severe. And that's because during that earlier time period, the US economy was much smaller. And as a result, the loss of jobs as a percentage of the total jobs was much greater. As you can see, back in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the US economy lost almost a quarter of non-farm jobs, over 24%. Whereas during the pandemic, although we lost 22 million jobs, that represented just below 15% of total employment. Oftentimes, it is more startling when we look at how many people are actually unemployed, people who are actively looking for work but have not been able to find jobs. And here you can see a similar trend. During the Great Depression, the number of people unemployed was almost 13 million. But during the pandemic, over 23 million people in April of last year were unemployed. Once again, though, the Great Depression, if you look at it in percentage terms, is more severe. The unemployment rate during the Great Depression was almost 25%, whereas during the pandemic last year, it was just under 15%, still very high, but on a percentage basis, not as high as during the Great Depression. During the Great Recession in 2009, unemployment nationally reached 10%. Over 15 million people were unemployed. So that gives you a sense of the level of employment. Which sectors were hit hardest by the pandemic? It should come as no surprise that sectors which required more interaction, more one-on-one contact, those sectors tended to be more severely adversely affected. So leisure and hospitality, for instance, at the national level, lost over 8 million jobs. And on a percentage basis, that was almost half of all the jobs. Over 48% of jobs in leisure and hospitality disappeared during the first 4 months of the pandemic, between January and April of last year. So that's fairly traumatic to lose almost 50% of the existing jobs that were there before the pandemic. Other sectors that also suffered quite a bit were retail trade, professional and business services. Manufacturing lost almost 1.5 million jobs, and the mining, logging, and construction industry also saw job losses. Let's turn now to output. Okay, we've seen employment. What about the level of what we call gross domestic product in real terms, real gross domestic product? As you can see here, the same three episodes have represented the most traumatic experiences for our macroeconomy over the last century. The Great Depression saw a drop in real GDP by over 26%. And remember, real GDP represents the value of everything that we produce domestically, all of the goods and services, from the farm commodities to the clothing and apparel, to the high-tech hardware and software products, to the entertainment services, to the telecommunication services, everything that we produce in the economy. Back in the Great Depression, that fell. The output of our economy fell by over a quarter. Very, very traumatic. During the Great Recession, although we talk of it as if it were really, really severe, and certainly it was the most severe recession since the Great Depression, but real GDP fell by only about 2.5%. During the pandemic, 2020, real GDP in the US economy fell by almost 3.5%. So that gives you a sense of the relative magnitudes of these events. What about income? So we have employment, we have output, but perhaps the most important thing from the standpoint of the average individual or family is the level of disposable income. So economists look at measures like real disposable income per capita. So disposable income essentially is the personal income after taxes that become available for purchasing goods and services. And we correct for population by looking at it on a per capita basis. And once again, you see that these three episodes over the last century have been very, very traumatic. During the Great Depression, real disposable income per capita fell by over a quarter. Okay, just like output, income fell by about 25%. During the Great Recession of 2008-2009, real disposable income per capita fell by only about 1%. So before the pandemic, the Great Recession was the most recent negative experience we had. But compared to the pandemic, it really wasn't that bad. The pandemic caused real disposable income per capita to fall by over 10% between April 2020 and October 2021. Disposable income represents purchasing power and in some sense represents the ability to enhance one's family's standard of living. So it's an important metric that gauges how well off we are. And when it is falling, obviously that is of concern. Those are some of the broad impacts of COVID on the national economy. Let me turn to the impact of COVID on the Erie local economy. Many of you are from Erie. If you are from out of town, perhaps from faraway places, if you're a Penn State alumnus, we welcome you back. And I hope that you will still share the same passion and interest in the Erie economy as we all do here. But looking at Erie in a similar kind of fashion, first focusing on employment, we see very, very similar patterns. Unfortunately for Erie, the data do not go back all the way to the Great Depression. So we really only can start at about 1950, which is the earliest time point for the Erie data. So if you look at the years since the middle of the 20th century, the Great Recession certainly was the most traumatic event until recently. The number of jobs we lost in Erie was over 8,000 during the Great Recession. That represented about 6% of the jobs that existed before that recession. During the pandemic in last year, much more severe. Just in 4 months between January and April, the Erie economy shed 26,000 jobs, and that represented 23% of the jobs that were there prior to the pandemic, almost a quarter. So very, very severe adverse effect. Those are the two major recent negative events in Erie. Again, we can't go back to the Great Depression. We don't have data that go that far back, but it turns out there was a third episode in Erie during the late 1970s and early 1980s that was also very traumatic. This was a period of recession. The economy really at that time was suffering from something called stagflation, where we had both high unemployment and high inflation. So if you look at the period between September 1979 and April 1983, Erie actually lost over 15,000 jobs, second only to the losses of the pandemic. And as a percent, the job losses during that period in the late 70s, early 80s was over 12%. So although we can't go as far back as the Great Depression, we do see this third event, this major recession in the late 70s in Erie, which caused a lot of job losses. This also shows up in the rate of unemployment, just like at the national level in Erie. If you look since the 1980s, the unemployment rate has spiked upward during those three episodes that I've just described. In the late 70s, early 80s, the unemployment rate actually shot up to 17%. Until the pandemic, that was almost unheard of because the unemployment rate has fallen to very, very low levels in recent years. During the Great Recession in 2010, unemployment shot up to almost 10%. Over 13,000 people were unemployed there. And in the pandemic, unemployment rate was 17.5%. So we have not seen the unemployment rate be so high since the early 1980s, with over 21,000 people in Erie unemployed during the pandemic. So those are employment numbers, which give us a picture of the magnitude of this very, very major event in our local economy. The sectors that were hardest hit in Erie are similar to the ones at the national level. Those that required more person-to-person contact or social interaction, those sectors tend to be hit most. So leisure and hospitality in Erie lost about 7,500 jobs. And that represented over 50%, almost 54% of jobs in the leisure and hospitality industry disappeared just over the 4 months between January and April of 2020. And the other sectors that lost jobs significantly, just like at the national level, were retail trade, professional and business services, mining, logging, and construction, and manufacturing. In terms of output, we don't yet have data for Eerie in terms of our gross domestic product. That won't come out for the year 2020 until later in December. But we do have data up to 2019, and what we can see is that although the Eerie output, what we produce here locally, has been rising, these lines represent the growth in GDP, and the numbers are indexed to a value of 100 in 2001. So by 2019, Erie's real GDP had risen by 6%, going from 100 to 106. The problem is that at the national level, shown by the red line, at state level in Pennsylvania, shown by the green line, the rate of increase has been much higher, 43% nationally, 30% at the state level. So although we don't yet have more recent data, unfortunately, Eerie has been growing much more slowly. And when the new data come out for 2020, it's probably reasonable to expect that we will see that output in Eerie also declined quite a bit as a result of the pandemic. What about income in Eerie? We also do not have disposable income numbers at the local level. These data typically are only available at the national level, but we do have data for Eerie in terms of average weekly earnings. And what we do see is, once again, the effects of the pandemic. Average weekly earnings fell by over 9% between July 2019 and December 2020. It is coming back up again. So as of October of this year, average weekly earnings are back up almost to the level of July 2019. But the pandemic certainly has had a major negative effect on what people earn in this area. Note that if you look at that line very carefully, the spikes upward do represent brief upticks in income for a few months, but then they drop back down again. So overall, the decline has been about 9%. One thing I wanted to point out in terms of the impact of COVID is that the effects have been very, very diverse. Not everybody has been affected the same way. Of course, we all know this. We hear it in the news. We also have personal experiences that show us that different people, different sectors are affected differently. But one example of this, I think, that stands out is given in this chart. This chart shows that in Eerie, the people who suffered the most job losses, unfortunately, also happen to be the lowest paid workers. So the chart measures on the vertical axis average weekly wage. So as you go upward vertically, you have occupations where workers are earning higher levels of wages on a weekly basis. On the horizontal axis, we measure how much employment change there was between January and April, the height of the pandemic. So as you move leftward, there were more job losses. As you move to the right, there were fewer job losses. And if you look at the pattern of the dots, the red dots, which reflect different occupational categories, what you'll see is a gradual upward pattern from the southwestern part of the chart moving up to the northeastern part of the chart. And that upward pattern from southwest to northeast indicates that as you move upward in terms of weekly wages, those who earn more, those are the occupations that have suffered fewer job losses because you're also moving to the right. But as you move down the weekly wage scale, as you move downward, you're also moving to the left, where these occupations to the left are experiencing more job losses. So the patterns of these red dots are very clear. This is a pattern that we observed nationally as well. But in Erie, I thought this would be good to highlight that here we are representative of really what's going on in the rest of the country, that the impact of the pandemic really has not been uniform across all individuals, all households, all sectors. It has had a very, very heterogeneous effect. Unfortunately, we see this in this chart very, very clearly. Lower paid workers have tended to suffer the most from the pandemic. What we do at the Institute here is we put together something called an Eerie Leading Index, which tracks the performance of the local economy and allows us to project what's likely to happen in the next 8 to 12 months. And I'm happy to report that our latest findings suggest that the worst of the pandemic seems to be behind us, that the Erie economy seems to be recovering, even though very, very modestly, because the Erie Leading Index has been pointing upward. So the green numbers you see represent improvements in the indicators that are used to compose this composite number. And there were only 2 indicators that were in negative territory. So the good news based on our local research is, according to the leading index that we compile, things seem to be getting a little bit better. But of course, it's still somewhat uncertain, especially given the most recent news of the variant, the Omicron variant that is emerging. So it remains to be seen, and we certainly will keep our fingers on this issue and keep our research up to date by examining whether these changes are likely to continue or whether the economy once again may head back in the other direction. So we're anxious to continue looking at this. So let me turn now just to some uncertainties and challenges that we still face ahead. Now that you've gotten a broad picture at the national level and at the local level of employment output and income and the impact of COVID on those three indicators. Some of the uncertainties, the pace of job recovery is still not 100%. So this is the number of jobs measured as a percentage. What percent of jobs that we lost during the pandemic have been recovered back. And as you can see, the US lost over 22 million jobs, but at the national level, we've only recovered about 82% of those lost jobs. In Erie, the job recovery rate is even lower at only about 65%. We lost 26,000 jobs. So the pace of job recovery needs to pick up. We're still a little bit concerned about that. Because of the pandemic, the federal government has embarked on several massive programs of fiscal stimulus. So another thing to keep our eyes on is the projected federal budget deficit and the federal debt. So as you can see, the Congressional Budget Office is projecting significant budget deficits and debt in the near term. And although the primary objective was to provide families with financial assistance, that was the overarching goal, in the backdrop, we also need to make sure we understand that that has an impact on federal spending. And to the extent that it makes the deficits and the debt become much larger, then we need to perhaps look at ways to rein in the deficit and the debt in the long run. Another thing that is a challenge is, as you probably know from your reading of current news, inflation is lurking in the picture. So we have not had inflation this high for over 30 years. So these bars represent the month-to-month change from one month to the next in terms of the consumer price index, which is an overall measure of the rate of inflation. And then if you look at it on a 12-month basis, okay, looking over the last year, what you see is that between October 2020 and October of this year, the inflation rate measuring the prices of all goods and services, it was over 6%. If you exclude food and energy prices, those items tend to be more volatile. If you exclude food and energy, the red line shows that the rate of inflation was lower. It was just under 5%. But both of these upward trends are reason for concern, and it remains to be seen whether the upward trajectory will continue. Government agencies like the Federal Reserve, the president, Congress, they're all expressing, their commitment to making sure that inflation doesn't run out of control, as it did in the 70s and early 1980s. Of course, you've all read about supply chain bottlenecks, so that remains an ongoing concern because of the pandemic, because of global supply chain disruptions. This may continue to contribute to rising prices and inflation. Consumers are important because consumers represent over 2/3 of the economy. So another challenge we face is that consumers seem to be expressing more pessimism. So this is the latest survey from the University of Michigan that shows us that consumers are expecting things to be getting a little bit worse before they get better. So after a brief uptick, given the optimism from the vaccines, consumer sentiment has again turned in the other direction. I will close by simply presenting you with some cautious optimism, a few words that perhaps will sound a little bit more uplifting. And these cautious optimistic notes are summarized in the range of forecasts for US economic growth next year. So I've given you forecasts by several major entities in the US: the Congressional Budget Office, the Conference Board, the US Federal Reserve. The Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank does a survey of professional forecasters, and PNC Financial Services Group right here in Pennsylvania. And you can see that all of these entities forecast fairly robust growth for both 2021, next year, and for the following year, although the growth rate in 2022 is expected to be slightly less. So on average, if you look at these forecasters, the average rate of growth is projected to be just under 6% for next year and just over 4% for the following year. So that's a bit of good news. It's especially good news because if you look over the last decade or so, we have not had growth in the US economy of over 3% for many, many years. So anything over 3% really is very, very, very spectacular, especially given the downturn at the end of last year due to the pandemic. So there are many other forecasts, but these are some of the more prominent ones that many people look to and many people rely upon. So I think that is a good way to finish by giving you a sense of hope for what is to come in the next 2 years. I want to thank you all again for your attention and for attending today's webinar. This is my contact information. As I said earlier, I've only had time to focus on some of the broad effects of the COVID pandemic. If you'd like to speak with me or discuss more or ask questions, I would be happy to speak with you. Feel free to contact me, but certainly now as well. I think Britt will entertain questions and I'd be happy to answer them. So I will share.
Thank you. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. We really appreciate it. Eye-opening for sure. We do have some questions. Just one quickly, when you talk about the pace of job recovery, it seems like there's a lot of jobs out there to be had. Manufacturing, they're always looking, everybody's hiring. Do you think it's people re-examining how they're going to get back into the workforce, maybe reevaluating what their choices have been?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and it's one that many people have asked. So from what I have read and analyzed, I think at first, the reluctance to get back into the labor force or to accept job offers, to a large extent, that reflected the normal concern with the ongoing pandemic. People were afraid. They didn't necessarily want to go back to work so fast until they were sure that the pandemic was under control. Related to that was, as we all know, childcare issues, especially for women who participate in the workforce. Without adequate childcare services, that put a damper on the re-entrance on the part of many women. But then turning to the heart of your question, Britt, what we see, I think, over time after that initial period is that, yes, people are starting to reevaluate their commitment and the nature of their attachment to their job, so that people are questioning whether they really want to do that same kind of work, whether they prefer more flexibility with jobs that provide hybrid forms of performance and so forth. So we do see a change in other words, attitudes and psychology, not just a pandemic related, but a true reexamination of what one wants to do. I think that's safe to say.
Okay, great. Okay, Amy asks, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover the fastest and which the slowest?
Yes, that's also a good question. So what we see when you actually look at the data is that it's somewhat counterintuitive, but if you think about it, it makes sense. The sectors that have suffered the most, the two most hard hit sectors, leisure and hospitality and retail trade, those ironically have been the two sectors that have recovered the most rapidly. So that as of the recent months, for instance, in retail trade, the number of jobs have come back to just about the same level as just before the pandemic. And leisure and hospitality, likewise, has been regaining jobs very, very robustly. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it makes sense because as the pandemic started to fade out, at least prior to this new discovery of the new variant, then those same sectors where people had to interact, people became more comfortable, right? Because the pandemic, it was felt, was being brought under control. And so those same sectors where the social interaction caused us to withdraw, as confidence came back, more people rushed in. And so those are the sectors that are going to, I think, recover faster. Now, the $64 million question is the new variant. If the new variant once again causes major problems, then I'm afraid those sectors that have recovered the fastest will once again be the sectors that are fastest to lose jobs because of that social component.
Interesting. Okay, will the disruption to global supply chains lead to a mini revival in selected sectors in manufacturing?
Yes, that's already beginning to happen. Many companies have either returned their production to the US. We call that onshoring as opposed to offshoring. And others have turned to suppliers domestically as opposed to relying on foreign suppliers. So you're already beginning to see that happen. Whether that trend continues to be very, very strong remains to be seen. And the reason is that globalization occurred over many years. And as a result, all of the linkages that developed between the US and other countries, all of these markets that are now very, very strongly intertwined, it's going to be quite difficult to unwind them and to loosen those linkages rapidly. So even though there is some retrenchment, some coming back to the US in terms of supply and production, we may still continue to see quite a bit of connection to the rest of the global economy. And so, which force is stronger, we'll have to wait and see.
Here's a question for academia. How do we expect the COVID economic effects to impact college undergraduate enrollment in the coming years?
Outstanding question, because we're in an academic setting. This is probably something that we're all here very interested in at Penn State. Like many other things, including the previous question, there are, I believe, opposing forces. There are things that pull us in two different directions. So for example, on the one hand, because COVID has had such a devastating effect on the labor market, what we might see is a boost in enrollments, because historically, what we observe is that when young people, people in that age cohort, see that there are fewer job opportunities, less prospect for finding good jobs, they tend to return back to school. So you might see an uptick in enrollments for that reason, if the pandemic keeps the labor market somewhat sluggish. On the other hand, we all know from firsthand experience that teaching in a COVID environment has been much, much more challenging. We switched literally overnight to a remote setting, and those kinds of disruptions, to the extent that they are harder to adapt on the part of the students, may cause students not to enroll. They may instead go to other vocational programs or decide not to go to college at all because they really want that in-person social interaction with their professors. And so if that force is strong, then we may actually see a dampening of college enrollments. For instance, especially at the international level, I think we're already seeing the fact that fewer international students are returning, not only because of travel restrictions, but because of just the sense that it's harder to adapt under these circumstances in this new teaching environment. So again, it's hard to predict because there are these two opposing forces. And certainly we would hope that the first trend is stronger, that students will see that a good option is to go to college if in the meantime they have not been able to find a good work.
Okay. Are there any predictions of another pandemic like this happening again? Or do you feel that countries will be better prepared in the future?
Well, with respect to the expectation of another pandemic, that would be completely out of my area of expertise. I'll leave that to the medical and health experts. But from what I do read and understand, most medical and health and public health experts do say that it is fairly certain that we will encounter other pandemics in the future. What kind is uncertain, how severe is uncertain, but given the evolution of societies across the world, those experts, not me, but those experts seem to think that we're probably going to see other pandemics. What I can speak to is the economic dimensions when we do have a pandemic. And I think, again, to end on an optimistic note, despite the very, very severe traumatic experience of this recent COVID-19 pandemic, I think many of us, both individually and organizationally, have just striven to adapt so that we now know how to do things that we didn't know before and how to do certain things better. In fact, some studies even suggest that we're seeing an uptick in productivity. Productivity seems to be increasing because companies are now implementing new policies, new organizational structures, new ways of operating that make it more efficient for them to interact with their workers, their customers, their clients, and so forth. So in that sense, the pandemic has led to some good things. Now, in the future, we can't tell whether we'll continue this to be able to be this resilient, but certainly I think we've changed enough that we can in the future continue to adapt to similar traumas.
Great. Well, I think that is all of our questions today. So Dr. Louie, we really appreciate you coming on today, and we appreciate all of our audience being here this morning. We hope you found it informative. I will say, if you're interested in making a gift to the Economic Research Institute, please reach out to me directly. My contact information has been added to the chat box. Your support allows the Institute to answer important questions for the Erie economy, as well as supporting a number of the students who help do the research. Our next Rise and Shine will take place on Thursday, January 6th, and will focus on food insecurity on campuses and how Penn State Behrend's Lion Pantry is helping to alleviate the problem. We hope you have a great day and a great holiday season. We look forward to seeing you in 2022. Thank you.